The summer Lenora Voss turned 24, the Arizona desert tried to kill her, not metaphorically. Not in the way people say the heat will get you, the loneliness will break you, the territory will chew you up and spit you out. It tried, deliberately and without apology, to swallow her whole. It started with a horse and a lie. The horse belonged to a man named Cutter Dade. Though Lenora hadn't known his name then, she'd only known the animal was fast, that it was tied outside the Holbrook telegraph office at 2 in the morning, and that she had approximately 4 minutes before Harlan Voss's men came through the back door of the hotel and found her gone. She wasn't proud of the theft. She'd untied the reins with shaking hands and told herself she'd send payment to Holbrook once she reached Flagstaff. She told herself a lot of things that night that turned out not to be true. The lie was the one she'd been living for 3 years, sewn into the lining of her traveling coat like a second skin, that she was Harlan Voss's dutiful daughter-in-law, that she had chosen this life, that the bruises on her wrist from his son Preston's grip were simply the price of being a woman in the Arizona territory of 1891. She had believed that lie long enough that dismantling it felt less like freedom and more like amputation. She rode north until the moon dropped behind the Mogollon Rim and the darkness became absolute. She rode until the borrowed horse stumbled on a shelf of fractured sandstone she hadn't seen in the black, pitching her forward over its neck with a violence that left no room for preparation. The ground came up fast and unforgiving. She heard the horse scream, a horrible sound she would carry in her chest for years afterward, and then she heard nothing at all. She woke to heat. Not the ambient heat of an Arizona morning, which arrives politely enough before it turns murderous, but the concentrated immediate heat of direct sun on dark rock. She was lying on her back, on a broad shelf of red sandstone, 30 feet below the trail she'd been riding. Above her, the horse was nowhere to be seen. The coat's sleeve was torn open at the shoulder, and the skin beneath it was scraped raw and weeping. When she tried to sit up, the world tilted sideways in a way that suggested she should reconsider. She reconsidered. She lay there and looked at the sky, which was the particular shade of blue that only exists in the high desert in early morning, before the heat bleaches it out to white. She thought about Preston Voss, who would wake in 4 hours and find her gone. She thought about Harlan Voss, who would not be angry the way ordinary men were angry, loudly and briefly, but the way powerful men were angry, quietly and at length, with consequences that extended for years. She thought about the envelope she'd taken from Harlan's strongbox 3 nights ago, the one currently pinned inside her coat's hidden pocket, the one she'd discovered when she was looking for the deed to her mother's property that Harlan had claimed as collateral on a loan she'd never agreed to. She did not think about how badly her head hurt, because thinking about it made it worse. The sound of boots on rock came from above and to her left, slow and deliberate, the footfall of someone who was not in a hurry and had no intention of being surprised. She turned her head carefully. A man was picking his way down the fractured slope toward her, and even from that distance, even squinting against the morning sun, she could see he was large in the way that some men were large, not from excess, but from use, broad across the shoulders, thick through the forearms, moving with a careful economy that suggested he knew exactly where to put each foot. He stopped about 10 feet away and looked at her the way you'd look at a problem you hadn't anticipated, but weren't entirely shocked to find. "Your horse ran off," he said. His voice was low and flat, the voice of a man who had spent a lot of time talking to no one. "Left leg's broken. I put it down." Lenora closed her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry." "Not your horse to apologize for." He came closer and crouched down beside her, not touching her, just looking. His face was weathered and blunt-featured, with a jaw that had been broken at some point and healed slightly crooked. His eyes were a shade of gray-brown that matched the canyon walls exactly. "Where are you hurt?" "Head," she said. "Shoulder. I don't think anything else is broken." "How do you know?" "I've had broken bones before." She said it without thinking, and immediately wished she hadn't, because she watched him absorb that information and add it to whatever picture he was assembling of her. "I can walk," she said. "Not yet, you can't." He reached into the canvas pack on his back and produced a battered tin canteen. "Drink this first." She drank because she needed it, because her mouth tasted like copper and dust and 3 years of accumulated silence. The water was warm but real. When she lowered the canteen, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Not pity, not suspicion. Something more neutral and patient. "There's a homestead 1/2 mile east," he said. "Mind. I can get you there, and you can rest until you're able to ride. I've got a mule you can borrow once you're steady." "I don't have any money to pay." "I didn't ask for any." She looked at him for a long moment. This stranger in a canyon who had put down her stolen horse and was offering her water and a mule as though it cost him nothing. Everything in her life had taught her that nothing was free from men, that offers had terms, and terms had teeth, but her head was swimming, and the nearest town was 30 miles of open desert, and the sun was already climbing. "Cutter Dade," he said, apparently reading her hesitation. He extended a hand. "I've been running cattle and minding my business on this land for 6 years. I'm not going to give you any trouble." "Lenora," she said. She did not give her last name. He helped her to her feet with an impersonal steadiness, one hand on her elbow until she found her balance, then released her immediately. She appreciated that. She followed him along the canyon floor and up a switchbacking trail that opened eventually onto a flat of sparse yellow grass, and beyond it a low stone house that looked like it had grown directly from the earth, like an outcropping, like something that had always been there. Inside it was cool and dim and smelled of wood smoke and something herbal she couldn't identify. The floor was swept clean. There was a cast-iron stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot against the far wall covered in a faded wool blanket. A rifle hung above the door. On the table sat a tin plate with the remains of breakfast and a cup of coffee that was still sending up a thin thread of steam. He cleared the plate and pointed her to the cot. She sat down on it with more relief than she wanted to show. "The coat," he said, and she looked up at him. "You should take it off. It's going to be 90 degrees in an hour." Lenora's hands went to the buttons. Her fingers froze there. The coat with its hidden pocket, the one she'd sewn herself the night before she'd run, a flat channel between the lining and the outer wool, just wide enough for the envelope that contained a letter from a United States federal judge, handwritten, detailing the terms of a bribery arrangement with Harlan Voss involving land grants, water rights, and the falsification of 3 court verdicts over the past decade. The envelope that, if the wrong person found it, would make Lenora a problem that needed solving. "I'm fine," she said. "I'll keep it." Cutter looked at her. "You're going to sweat through it." "I said I'm fine." He didn't argue. He turned to the stove and she watched him move around his own kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been living alone long enough that every motion was habitual and precise. He put coffee on. He took a clean cloth from a drawer and wetted it at the water basin and brought it to her without asking, holding it out until she took it and pressed it to the wound on her head. The cloth came away pink. He went back to his tasks. She sat on his cot and pressed the cloth to her temple and tried to figure out how badly she had miscalculated. She had planned to reach Flagstaff in 2 days, find a lawyer she'd found the name of through careful, secret inquiry, a man named Aldrich, who had a reputation for taking cases that embarrassed powerful people. She had the evidence. She had, she'd thought, a plan. What she hadn't planned for was the horse, the sandstone, this particular canyon, and this particular man, who was now pouring coffee into a chipped enamel cup and setting it on the table near her without a word. She should not be here. She should not be resting in a stranger's house while Harlan Voss's riders fanned out across the territory. "You're afraid of something," Cutter said. He sat down in the chair across the room, not at the table, not close to her. He wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at her with that same neutral patience. "Not of me. Something you brought with you." She said nothing. "That's fine," he said. "You don't owe me an explanation." He drank his coffee. "But if someone is coming onto my land looking for you, I'd like to know." The silence in the room stretched out. Outside, a pair of crows called back and forth across the flat. "Yes," she said finally, "someone might be." He nodded once, as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "How many?" "I don't know. His father has." She stopped. "His father," Cutter repeated. She looked at the floor. The words she'd been carrying for 3 years were wedged tight somewhere between her sternum and her throat, and she had to force them out past 3 years of silence. "My husband's family. My husband's father, specifically. He owns half of Navajo County and has arrangements with the other half." She looked up. "I took something that proves it." Cutter was very still. "I know how that sounds," Lenora said. "I know I look like exactly what I am, which is a woman who stole a horse and a document and is sitting in your house bleeding on your cot. What did you take?" She hesitated for only a moment. Then she reached inside the coat, her fingers finding the seam of the hidden pocket, and she drew out the envelope. She held it out to him. He didn't reach for it immediately, just looked at it. "A letter," she said, "from Judge Orrin Calder in Prescott, written to Harlan Voss. It outlines their arrangement. Land for verdicts." She kept her voice steady. 3 families lost their homesteads because Calder ruled against them. Harlan took the land. The letter proves it. The color in Cutter Dade's face did something strange. Not pale exactly, but a tightening, a shift, as though the bones beneath had moved slightly. "Calder," he said. The word came out flat and careful. "You know him." He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the flat yellow grass, his hands at his sides. A long moment passed. When he turned around, his jaw was set, and his eyes had changed, had gone from patient gray-brown to something darker and harder underneath. "5 years ago," he said, "Orrin Calder ruled in a civil case that my family's ranch in the Verde Valley was to be awarded to Harlan Voss on the grounds of an unpaid debt. The debt did not exist. My father had the receipts, had witnesses, had everything a man was supposed to need. Calder ruled against him in 40 minutes. He looked at her. My father died 6 months later. Heart gave out. My mother moved to Tucson to live with her sister. I came here." Lenora felt the air in the room rearrange itself around that information. "The 3 families in the letter," she said slowly. "Do you know the names?" "I know 2 of them." His voice was careful in a way that it hadn't been before. "I grew up with their sons." She held out the envelope again. This time he took it. He drew out the letter and read it, and she watched his face the way she'd learned to watch faces, the careful, involuntary reveals that happened around eyes and mouths when people thought no one was paying attention. She watched the moment he reached the part about the Verde Valley. His breath let out slow and deliberate through his nose. "Aldrich," he said, not looking up, "you're taking this to Theodore Aldrich in Flagstaff." She blinked. "You know him." "He was my father's attorney. He's been trying to build a case against Harlan Voss for 4 years. Cutter folded the letter back into the envelope with the careful hands of someone who understood exactly what he was holding. "He's been missing one piece." He looked up at her then, and the full weight of the coincidence settled over the room like a dropped stone. "This is it." The sound that reached them next came from outside, faint but distinct, the jangle of a bridle in the still morning air. Cutter moved before she could speak. He crossed the room in 4 steps and took the rifle down from above the door. He went to the window and looked, then came back and crouched in front of her, his voice dropping to almost nothing. 3 riders, coming in from the south. He pressed the rifle into her hands without asking whether she could use it. "There's a cellar door in the floor behind the stove. Get in it and pull the rug back over." "No." The word came out of her quietly, but with a solidity that surprised even her. "I am not hiding in a cellar while you deal with my problem alone." He looked at her for 1 second. His jaw moved slightly. Then he went to the drawer beneath the table and pulled out a short-barreled Colt Navy revolver, checked its cylinder with a practiced snap, and held it out to her. "You know how to use this." She took it. "My mother taught me. She said a woman in the Arizona Territory needed to know how to put 6 shots in a tight pattern before she learned how to bake bread." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close to it. "Get behind the stove. If they come through the door, you stay low and aim center." She moved to the stove. She pressed her back against the warm iron, wrapped her right hand around the grip of the revolver, and waited. The riders came in slow, the way men do when they own the outcome and want you to know it. Through the small window she could see them now. 3 men on horses, their clothes dusty from the road. The particular flat-eyed look of men who did Harlan Voss's errands without much interest in the moral arithmetic of what those errands entailed. The one in front was named Hendricks. She recognized his hat, a flat-crowned brown felt he'd worn to every Sunday supper at the Voss table. "Hello, the house," Hendricks called. His voice carried the exaggerated courtesy of a man who had been told to appear reasonable until he had reason not to be. Cutter opened the door and stood in the frame, rifle down at his side. From where Lenora crouched behind the stove, she could only see his back and shoulders, but she could read his stillness like a sentence. "Something I can help you with?" "Looking for a woman," Hendricks said pleasantly. "Young, brown hair, riding alone, which you'd think she'd know better." He paused. "Her family's worried." "Haven't seen her." A silence. The kind that expands as the person on the receiving end of it decides whether to believe you. "Mind if we take a look around?" "I do mind," Cutter said. "This is private property. You want to search it, ride to Holbrook and come back with a warrant." Another silence. Lenora's hand was steady on the revolver's grip, but her heartbeat was everywhere, in her throat, in the ends of her fingers. "Mr. Voss is very concerned about his daughter-in-law," Hendricks said, and the pleasantness had thinned to something more structural, like a smile with the warmth removed. "She's confused. She took something that belongs to the family. We're just here to bring her home safe." "I said I haven't seen her." Cutter's voice hadn't changed. It had the same flat, patient register it had had when he offered her water in the canyon. "And I'll say it once more before this conversation ends. Whatever business Harlan Voss has in this county, it doesn't extend to my property. Now ride back the way you came." "Friend," Hendricks said, and now the pleasantness was entirely gone. "Strip back to the frame. You don't know who you're talking to." "Harlan Voss's men," Cutter said. "I know who I'm talking to. I also know Judge Calder signed Voss's land grabs, and I know my father's name was on that list. So you'll understand if I don't feel particularly inclined to cooperate." He raised the rifle. Not pointing it, just raising it. "Get off my land." In the silence that followed, Lenora heard the particular quality of a calculation being made, the way a group of men assess each other's resolve and decide whether the math favors them. Then she heard the creak of saddle leather as Hendricks shifted his weight, and she knew before it happened that it was going to happen. He went for his gun. Cutter fired once, and Hendricks' horse bolted, screaming, carrying its rider 20 yards to the left before the man fell from the saddle into the dust. The other 2 riders scattered, one pulling hard east, the other driving his horse directly at the house. Lenora heard the hoofbeats coming fast, heard the horse veer at the last moment, and the rider's boot hit the front wall, and then the door burst open with a force that knocked Cutter sideways into the doorframe. The man through the door was young and scared and swinging a pistol in a wide arc that was going to hit something through pure geometry. Lenora stepped out from behind the stove. "Put it down," she said. He turned toward her, and for a fraction of a second she saw the decision happen in his eyes, the way fear and calculation collapsed into the same point, and she understood exactly what he was going to do before he did it. She shot him in the shoulder. He went down hard, and the pistol spun across the floor, and he stayed down, clutching his arm and making a sound that was more surprise than pain. Lenora stood with the smoke curling from the Colt's barrel and her hands not shaking, which surprised her. Cutter appeared in the doorway. He looked at the man on the floor. He looked at Lenora. "Third one ran," he said. She lowered the revolver. "He'll go back to Harlan." "Yes." He stepped over the man on the floor with the same economical care he applied to everything, and went to the window to check the yard. "We have maybe 6 hours before Voss sends a proper contingent. More men. Possibly the county sheriff, depending on what Harlan's paid him." Lenora looked down at the man she'd shot. He was still alive, breathing in ragged pulls, his shoulder a mess. He was maybe 20 years old. She didn't recognize him, which meant he was new, which meant Harlan had been expanding his operation. "Can you ride?" Cutter asked her. She pulled her attention back. "Yes." "Then we're not waiting 6 hours." He was already moving, pulling a saddlebag from the peg by the door and beginning to pack it with the particular efficiency of someone who had known, on some level, that a morning like this was always in the future. "I've got 2 horses. We can make Flagstaff by tomorrow midday if we don't stop." "You don't have to come," she said. He paused with the saddlebag in his hands. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the canyon, with that patient gray-brown attention. But now there was something else in it, something that had been there since she'd said the word Calder. "My father's name is in that letter," he said, "in the list of the families who were cheated." He set the saddlebag down. "I've been sitting in this canyon for 5 years waiting for something I could do about it. I'm not staying behind while you carry it to Flagstaff." She held his gaze for a moment. The morning light through the window caught the side of his face, and she noticed for the first time the way he held himself, not like a man who had given up, but like one who had been waiting, as deliberately and patiently as he did everything else, for exactly this. "Then pack fast," she said. They rode north through the heat of the day and into the cooler air of the high plateau, pushing the horses to a steady, ground-covering trot that ate up the miles. Cutter rode slightly ahead on the trail, his back straight, the rifle scabbarded against his saddle. Lenora rode behind him and thought about the letter in her coat pocket, about how long she'd carried it alone. They made camp at dusk beside a dry creek bed in the pinon and juniper, and Cutter built a fire small enough not to signal anyone who might be looking and cooked a meal out of his saddlebags that was simple and hot and better than anything she'd eaten in 3 years of Sunday suppers at the Voss table. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was different from the silence she was used to, which had the quality of a room where something was being carefully not said. This was just quiet, just 2 people sharing a fire in the dark, each carrying their particular weight without making the other responsible for it. "He lied to a jury," Lenora said at some point. The fire had burned down to coals. Calder. "Yes." She pulled her coat closer. "He said the things that sounded like justice, and they were lies all the way through. I sat across from him at dinner twice. He shook my hand." She looked at the coals. "I want people to know what he is." Cutter was quiet for a moment. "Aldrich will make sure they do." He looked across the fire at her. "Why did you stay? 3 years is a long time." She had thought about this, had given it the careful interior accounting that you give to the choices you're most ashamed of. "Because I didn't know what I had until I started looking for something else." She turned the Colt's grip over in her hands, a habit she'd developed, just the solid weight of it. "I was looking for the deed to my mother's property. I found the letter by accident, and once I'd read it, I couldn't put it back and pretend." "No," Cutter said. "You couldn't." They reached Flagstaff in the early afternoon of the second day, dusty and tired and smelling of horses and wood smoke. Theo Aldrich's office was on a side street off the main thoroughfare, marked by a hand-lettered sign that had weathered to near illegibility. He was a small, precise man of about 60, who wore his suspenders at full tension and had the slightly compressed look of someone who had been holding a great deal in for a very long time. He read the letter standing up. He read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk and pressed both palms flat against the surface and looked at the middle distance for a moment, and Lenora watched him recalibrate, watched him integrate this piece into whatever larger structure he'd been building. "The Dade property in the Verde Valley," he said. "Yes," Cutter said. "And the 3 verdicts." Aldrich looked at the letter again. He signed his name to it. There was something in his voice that was not quite disbelief and not quite relief, but held elements of both. Calder signed his name to it. "He did," Lenora said. Aldrich looked at her for the first time since he'd started reading. "How did you get this?" "I took it from a locked box." She met his eyes. "I am prepared to testify to where I found it and under what circumstances. I'm also prepared to testify regarding the conditions of my marriage and the assets my father-in-law acquired through coercion after my mother's death." Her voice didn't break. She'd decided, somewhere on the second day of writing, that it wasn't going to break. "I want my mother's land back, and I want Harlan Voss to answer for what he did to those families." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "this is going to be a difficult road. Harlan Voss will come at you with every resource he has. There will be pressure, and there will be threats, and there will be days when you wonder if it's worth it." "I've already had those days," Lenora said. "I had them for 3 years. I'd rather have them while doing something." He nodded slowly. He picked up the letter and held it with the careful, deliberate grip of someone who understood that they were holding the center of something. "Then let's get started." The legal proceedings took 11 months. They were not easy months. Harlan Voss did exactly what Aldrich had predicted. Came at her through lawyers and rumors, and one incident in which a man she didn't recognize appeared outside her boarding house on a Tuesday evening and stood there for 20 minutes before walking away. She reported it to the federal marshal's office, which Aldrich had arranged to take jurisdiction over the case. After that, no one appeared outside her boarding house again. Preston Voss filed for annulment on the grounds of abandonment, which she did not contest, and which the territorial court granted in 4 months. She felt nothing about this except a mild and practical relief. Orrin Calder resigned from the bench in February, 2 months before his federal indictment. He retained 3 attorneys and said publicly that the letter was a forgery. The analysis of the paper, the ink, and the handwriting by the territorial examiner took 6 weeks and was unambiguous. Harlan Voss was indicted on 8 counts. The land grants were reviewed. The Verde Valley property was among 3 that were formally contested and remanded to the territorial court for reconsideration. It took 7 months, but the ruling came back right. Cutter was there the day the verdict was read into the record. He was standing at the back of the courtroom in Prescott, still wearing the same flat-crowned hat he'd had in the canyon, and Lenora watched his face when the clerk read the words that gave his family's land back to his name, that put it officially and permanently back where it belonged, and she saw him close his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. She thought about his father, about her mother, about all the losses that could be recovered and all the ones that couldn't, about the fact that justice arriving late was still, somehow, justice. He found her afterward on the courthouse steps in the afternoon sun. "Aldrich says the criminal case will take another year," she said. "I know." He stood beside her and looked out at the street, at the ordinary afternoon commerce of a territorial capital going about its business. "I'm not in a hurry." She looked at him sideways. He was still and patient in the afternoon heat, the way he was still and patient in his kitchen, on the canyon trail, beside the fire. "You're going back to the homestead?" "Eventually." He looked at her. "You?" She'd been thinking about this, about what came after, about the property in the Verde Valley that had to be rebuilt, about the law degree she'd been reading toward in secret for 2 years at the Voss house because there had been nothing else to do with the rage she couldn't afford to show, about the fact that she was 24 years old and had spent 3 years inside a life that belonged to someone else, and now had the peculiar, terrifying freedom of her own. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's all right." He looked back at the street. The afternoon sun put a long shadow from the courthouse across the dust. "There's no particular hurry on that either." She stood on the courthouse steps in the territory of Arizona in the autumn of 1892, with the case file in her bag and the sun on her face, and 3 years of silence finally broken into something she could live in. The ghosts her marriage had made were still there. She suspected they'd be there for a while, but they were quieter now, in the way that things get quieter when they've been spoken out loud, when they've been put into the record by a clerk in a territorial courtroom and made real in the way that only witnessed things can be. She was the one who had taken the letter. She was the one who had ridden through the night and fallen in a canyon and handed a stranger evidence that changed both their lives. She had done it frightened and unprepared and without any guarantee it would work. And it had worked anyway. She thought that was worth carrying forward. There's a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. Not the gunshot, not the courtroom. It's the moment Lenora is sitting on a stranger's cot in the Arizona heat, her hands on her coat buttons, and she stops, because inside that coat is the one thing she's been carrying alone for 3 days, the thing that could save her or get her killed, and she doesn't know yet which one it's going to be. That pause is where the whole story lives, really. I think about what it took for her to do what she did, not the dramatic parts. Riding through the night, firing a revolver in a stranger's kitchen. I mean the quiet part that came before all of that, the part where she was in Harlan Voss's house, living inside a life that didn't belong to her, and she made herself keep looking, keep paying attention, keep reading things carefully, even when what she found made her hands shake. That's not something that happens by accident. That's a particular kind of honesty, with yourself, about what you're seeing, about what it means, about what it's going to cost you to act on it. Most people, when they find something that dangerous, put it back and tell themselves they imagined it. Lenora didn't. That choice, that single, quiet, unglamorous choice, is what everything else in this story is built on. And then there's Cutter. 6 years in a canyon, sitting on a loss he couldn't fix, waiting for something he could actually do. When Lenora handed him that letter, he didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh it or calculate it or look for the safer option. He read his father's name in the list of the wronged, and he said simply, "I'm not staying behind." That kind of steadiness doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from having thought deeply and seriously about what you actually believe is right, and having decided that you're going to act on it, even when it costs you something. What Lenora and Cutter each brought to this was different, but it was also the same thing underneath. They both understood, in their different ways, that if you see something wrong, and you have the ability to do something about it, then not doing something is itself a choice you'll carry. They both chose not to carry that particular weight. The outcome wasn't guaranteed. 11 months of legal proceedings, pressure, a man standing outside a boarding house on a Tuesday night. There were 100 moments where it could have collapsed. What kept it from collapsing wasn't luck. It was that Lenora refused to stop, even when stopping would have been easier. That's what I mean when I say this story is about something more than a letter and a trial. It's about what it actually looks like to see something through. Not heroically, not cleanly, but day after day, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that the thing matters more than the difficulty of doing it. The land came back, the record was corrected, the name of an honest man was put back where it belonged. That doesn't undo what was lost, but it means the loss was the last word, not the only word. I think that's what any of us can do, when we're paying attention and we're willing to stay in it. Notice what's actually true. Know what we believe. Keep going anyway. It's not a small thing. It's almost everything.